There is a particular person you cannot stop judging. You know exactly who I mean. The one whose particular flavor of brokenness inflames you. The one you cannot pray for without the prayer becoming a request that they change. The one whose name comes up and something in you tightens before you have decided whether you want to. I want to tell you something today that may unsettle you a little, and I want to start with the unsettling thing because it is the most useful thing I have to give you. The person you cannot stop judging is the most accurate map to your own buried self that you currently have. Welcome to the Christian Jung Podcast. I am Angela Meir, Christian, Jungian, writer, contemplative, and theologian in formation. This podcast exists because I believe that healing as deep as your theology is not just a nice idea. It is the actual telos of everything Jesus is doing in you. Before we go further, I want to speak directly to the Christians in the room who are already bracing for what I might be speaking about. And maybe you've heard the phrase shadow projection before, and you're wondering if I'm about to take your hard earned discernment and call it a pathology. You are possibly wondering if this is one of those teachings that reduces serious Christian moral perception to a psychological defense mechanism. I want you to stay with me for a moment. That is not what we're doing here. Discernment is real. The capacity to call sin sin is part of the gift of moral seriousness. I'm not asking you to lay that down. I am asking you to consider that there is a difference between the calm work of discernment and the charged work of projection. Both can look like moral perception from the outside. Only one is actually doing the spiritual work it claims to be doing. And the surgical precision required to tell them apart is the precision Jesus gave us in Matthew chapter 7 when he talked about the speck and the plank. He was not making a generic point about humility. He was teaching you how to read your own judgments. I'm going to say that again. Jesus was teaching us how to read our own judgments. Stay with me. This is some of the most useful scripture for the inner life, and most of us have been told it means something less specific than it actually says. It's time to awaken holy wonder. Welcome to the Christian Jung. I'm Angela Meir. I'm a PhD theology student with 2 advanced degrees in Carl Jung's psychology. In my own longing for a deeply transformative Christian experience, I found that the psychologist Carl Jung had already provided us with tools that are deeply biblical and aligned with the Christian faith. The rich spiritual tradition that we inherited from the Celtic saints, the Desert Fathers, and the Book of Acts is available for us today. Let's journey together as we discover the spirit in Christianity and water the dry, aching areas of our soul. I want to tell you a story before we get into the teaching because I think you will recognize maybe something in yourself. There was a woman I could not stop judging, and I'm not going to name her because that is not the point of the story. She was someone, however, I encountered in ministry circles for years. She was bold in ways that I frankly found unseemly. She used her platform with a kind of self promotional confidence that struck me as unchristian. She did not seem to wait to be invited. She inserted herself. She advocated for her own gifts loudly and without apparent shame. And every time her name came up, I felt the same low grade contempt rise within me. And I had a long inventory of theological reasons that contempt was justified. You know, Christians are supposed to be humble. We're supposed to be servant leaderships and without waiting to be called or asked to come to the stage. And the proud go before destruction. Just lots of these types of scripture screaming in my head every time I encountered her. She was not modeling sanctification, in my opinion. And I rehearsed that case over and over, and I felt like I had an airtight one, to be honest with you. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to ask the question that should have been the very first one. Why was she occupying so much of my attention? I did not actually know her. We had no relationship, and she had never wronged me, and yet she was a fixed presence in my mental landscape, a recurring object of my moral appraisal. You know, we use the term people who live rent-free in your head. This was the case here, and the intensity of my response was completely disproportionate to any actual interaction that had happened between us. When I finally sat with this discomfort, however, something came up. And that was that The boldness I despised in her was the boldness I had spent my entire adult life pretending I did not have. I am the daughter of missionaries, and I had learned to be a good Christian woman. And what that meant, it meant to me that I needed to wait or defer or to make myself useful in the background, to be summoned rather than to summon. And the version of me that wanted to be in the front of the room, the version that knew her gifts and wanted to use them publicly, the version that did not want to apologize for my ambition, that version was the most thoroughly buried part of me. And when I encountered her in someone else, walking around freely, taking up space without any apology, my unconscious did exactly what unconsciousnesses do. It threw the contempt outward. It said, "That is not me, that is her." And it did so with such force and with such moral confidence that for years I could not see I was looking at my own buried boldness reflecting back at me through someone I had decided was theologically wrong. I cried for about an hour the day I finally did see it, and not because I had done anything terrible, but just this awareness coming over me that this woman I had spent so long judging had been carrying for me in my own awareness the part of myself that was wanting to be okay and safe within me. And that is what projection does. It throws what you cannot bear in yourself onto another person, and then it lets you condemn it from a safe distance. And the more spiritually serious you are, the better cover you have for not seeing what is happening. So let's talk about projection because I want you to have a definition that will serve you for the rest of your life. Carl Jung defined projection as a psychological mechanism by which the contents of the unconscious are perceived as belonging to someone else. The word itself is precise. To project is to throw forward. The mind takes what it cannot acknowledge in itself and casts it outward where it can be seen and condemned and managed at a safe distance. The unconscious is not random about this. It does not throw everything outward indiscriminately. It projects with surgical accuracy onto whatever person, group, or pattern that closely matches the buried material. This is why the people who occupy your moral attention are not random. The patterns of your judgment are themselves a map of your own shadow. Now, here is what makes this particularly important for Christians. The very vigilance that religious communities cultivate, the practice of identifying what is wrong in the world and naming it as sin, becomes the perfect vehicle for the shadow's exit. You do not look like a person with a problem when you're condemning a problem. You look like a discerning Christian. The more morally articulate the projection becomes, the harder it is for the projecting person to see what is actually happening within themselves. This is not a critique of Christian moral seriousness. It is a warning about how easily Christian moral vocabulary can become a hiding place. The thing that protects us is also the thing that can hide what we have not dealt with. The shadow does not stay quietly contained. It cannot. Whatever is repressed exerts pressure to be known. And when the conscious mind refuses to receive it, the unconscious finds another route. The route it most reliably takes is to project the disowned material outward. The sermon Paul preaches against in Romans 2 is exactly this dynamic, the judgment that condemns yourself in the very act of condemning the other. Jung wrote about projection across his career, but the most concentrated treatment is in Aion, published in 1951. Aion is Jung's mature work on the structure of the psyche, and projection is at the center of it. He observed that the shadow is not primarily evil, it is primarily exiled or exiled material within us. It is composed of whatever the conscious self deemed unacceptable within ourselves. And in religious environments, what gets declared unacceptable is often the most ordinary parts of being human: desire, doubt, anger, boldness, hunger for recognition, maybe, or hunger for being seen, the wildness of genuine longing. These are not sins, they are the raw material of the soul. But when they are buried rather than consecrated, they do not lie quietly. They wait, and then they project. Jung was particularly clear about religious projection in another work, Psychology and Religion, which began as Terry Lectures at Yale in 1937 and was published in 1938. He argued that the more rigidly a religious community defines the acceptable self, the larger and more volatile its shadow tends to become. The pressure to conform to an ideal image does not eliminate what falls outside that image. It drives it underground, where it accumulates force, and the force exits through projection. Every religious community has its preferred targets, and the projections often track precisely with what the community has most thoroughly forbidden in itself. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote candidly about his own experience of this in the church of his father, a Swiss Reformed pastor. The doubt could not be voiced in his father. The intellectual restlessness could not be acknowledged. And what his father had to bury in himself, Jung watched come back to him projected onto others. Jung described the strange experience of finding himself contemptuous of qualities in his peers that he could not see were the very qualities he had spent the most effort suppressing in himself. He called this the most reliable signature of shadow content. The qualities you cannot tolerate in others, with a heat that seems disproportionate, are the qualities you have most thoroughly buried in yourself. Now, let's hold that beside Matthew 7. In verses 3 through 5, Jesus says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." I want you to read this with fresh eyes. Jesus is not making a generic point about humility. He is naming a specific psychological mechanism with specific structural features. The speck and the plank are the same kind of object. He is not saying you are seeing dust where they have lumber. He is saying you are seeing the small version of your own larger version. The thing you have located in them as a problem worth addressing, you have a more advanced form of yourself. And the reason you cannot stop attending to it in them is precisely because it is unaddressed in you. The energy you spend on their speck is energy that should be doing work on your own plank. He is making a diagnostic claim. The intensity of your judgment is correlated with the magnitude of the corresponding wound in yourself. This is not a metaphor Jesus is using. He's naming a psychological law. He is naming as part of how the human heart works. Paul talks about this as well in Romans 2:1. You, therefore, have no excuse. Who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. The act of judgment is self-revelation. I'm going to say that again. The act of judgment is self-revelation. James says the same in James 4:11 through 12. There is only one lawgiver and judge. When we take up a posture of judgment with charge, we are not exercising legitimate moral perception. We are usurping a position not given to us, and the position itself becomes a hiding place for what we have not dealt with. These are not separate teachings. What Paul is naming, what Jesus is naming, and what Jung was naming are three witnesses to the same psychological reality. And Jung named the mechanism, but scripture identified it first. And the integration of the two is one of the gifts of doing depth work as a serious Christian. I want to pause here and say something. If this is landing for you, if you're starting to feel the heat of recognition rising as you think about specific people, I want to invite you to come deeper. Every episode of the Christian Jung has a companion piece in the Inner Room, which is my paid Substack space. This week's Inner Room article gives you a contemplative protocol specifically for projection work. These practices are drawn from real Christian tradition, and you get some interesting ideas for journaling through these things or embodying these things somatically. Together, they form a 45-minute weekly rhythm that turns your judgments from spiritual liability into spiritual instruction. The link is in the show notes. It's only $12 a month, and I keep this door open. All you have to do is go to Substack and look for the Christian Jung there. I hope to see you. So, I want to give you 3 things to carry with you from this episode. The first is this: projection is not a character flaw. It is the soul's signature when it has not yet been able to integrate something. The shadow projects because the burial was protective in the first place. To meet what you have projected is to be asked to do consciously, with adult resources, the work the soul refused to do as a child. It is real work. It hurts, but it is not failure. It is the work of integration arriving on schedule. The second is this: the people you most reliably judge are not random. They are the most accurate map to your buried self that you currently have. This is not a reason to stop having moral perception. It is a reason to read your moral perception with one extra layer of discernment. When the perception is calm and proportionate to the situation, your discernment is doing what discernment is supposed to do. When the perception is hot and disproportionate and recurring and patterning, the perception itself is data about you, not just about them. Pay attention to the heat. The heat is the signal. The third point I want to say is this: projection breaks slowly in the company of God who is not afraid of what he finds. You will not solve a projection in a single contemplative session. You may not solve one in a year. The practice is to keep showing up to the noticing, to keep bringing the barriered self before the one who searches the heart, to trust that the slow integration is being done by the one who actually knows what he is doing, even when you do not feel anything happening. Search me, O God, know my heart. Psalms 139. When God actually searches what he finds, he leads. Lead me in the way everlasting from Psalm 139. So projection is the mechanism by which the shadow speaks through your judgment. The speck and the plank are the same kind of object with you carrying the larger version of what you have located in others. The intensity of your judgment is correlated with the magnitude of the corresponding wound within you. So there are 3 signatures: the trait that disgusts you most viscerally, the person you cannot pray for honestly, the repeated moral confrontation. This work is not to stop judging, but to follow the heat to its source. The God who describes the speck and the plank is the same God willing to do the surgery, and he is not in a hurry. Before we close, I want to give you the pause, pray, and heal portion of this episode. So sit for a moment now and breathe deeply, if you can. Ask this question without rushing toward an answer. Who is the person I currently find myself most reliably judging and with the most charge or heat? Be specific. Name them. Pray this short prayer from Teresa of Avila, who understood the inner life with rare precision. Lord, give me the grace to see myself as you see me, that I may not flee what you wish to heal in me. And finally, one sentence in your journal this week. What is the trait in this person that I find most intolerable? And where in my own history was that trait most thoroughly forbidden? Thank you for being here. If this episode spoke to something real in you, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the Christian Jung on Substack, where the free articles go deeper than the podcast really can, and where the inner room is the place where practices live. You can find everything there at Substack or the Christian Jung, or you can just go to my website, angelamere.com. Next week, we'll move on from this into deeper work of the shadow. Until next week, stay with me as we awaken holy wonder. If this podcast has become part of your journey, please consider leaving a review so others know they're not alone when they find it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share.